Right. What the final thing's gonna look like. All right.
So this is the February 11, 2020 Town of Easton Zoning Board of Appeals meeting. First on the agenda is a continued public hearing, variance number 19-10. Applicant is seeking relief from dimensional and density regulations to allow the construction of a garage on the premises located at 15 Summerfield Lane. There was nothing new in the file from anybody in the town, so you guys are all set.
Mr. Chairman, very well. How are you?
Good.
Good evening. For the record, Attorney Barry Crimmins of 909 Washington Street in Stoughton, here on behalf of the petitioners, Mr. and Mrs. Stephen Condell, who are here this evening along with their son Andrew. Also present this evening, as was present at the October 22nd meeting, is their contractor, Mr. Brian Chase.
Grace.
Sorry, Brian.
Yep, quality construction.
Question, if I may, as a preliminary matter, Mr. Chairman. Do we have the same 5 members present that were at the October 22nd meeting?
We did.
Okay.
Yes, we did.
Okay.
So we should be okay there. And just to sort of recap, so you don't have to rehash things.
Yep.
I think, the board is aware of what the original plan was, where the garage was going to go. The neighbor had testified at the last hearing that he was comfortable with where it was presently situated, and I think the board had expressed some concerns on getting over that variance threshold.
Right.
So that's sort of where we're at, if
Yep.
you want to pick up from
Sure.
there.
No, that would be great. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
May I pass out to the members a copy of my brief in support of our application?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope that is visible to the members, but if it is not, you have a copy, reduced size of this plot plan in the brief. I believe it's attached as Exhibit C. And if I may, and bearing in mind the chairman's comments, so this is a variance application for a proposed 2-car garage that the Condells are looking to construct at the end of their driveway, approximately 4.5 feet off of the property line. The bylaw requires a 15-foot setback, so we are looking for a variance of approximately 10.5 feet. Now let me go right to the criteria under the statute. Your bylaw references Chapter 48, Section 10, the variance criteria. If I may, I can sort of direct the members to the section of my brief where I get into, it starts on page 3, references in Section 3, authority and jurisdiction, the bylaw section, that then in turn references Chapter 48, Section 10. Part 4 of my brief refers to the standard for the variance, and I won't bother the members with reading that. You're all certainly familiar with what the criteria is. So if I may go to page 4, Section 5, the argument in support of the variance, and directing your attention to the second paragraph there. It says, in determining whether to grant a variance, the board is bound under the provisions of Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 48, Section 10, to consider the following factors. 1, whether there are unusual circumstances relating to the soil conditions, shape, or topography of such land or structures, and especially affecting such land or structures, but not affecting generally the zoning district in which it is located. Number two, whether a literal enforcement of the provisions of the bylaw or statute would involve a substantial hardship, financial or otherwise, to the petitioner. And three, whether the desired relief may be granted without substantial detriment to the public good and without nullifying or substantially derogating from the intent or purpose of the bylaw. So the statute sets forth the criteria that we must meet to the satisfaction of the board in support of the variance.
So you do agree it's discretionary with the board, it's not mandatory?
Oh, absolutely. Oh,
Okay.
absolutely, yeah. So number one, there are the unusual circumstances that relate to the soil condition, shape, or topography of the land. And let me go through, and let me at the outset say, there's nothing in this particular application that we're arguing anything to do with the shape, notwithstanding that, it has somewhat of an irregular shape, but that's not really contributing to the need for the variance. What is contributing to the need for the variance are two things: the soil conditions of the property and the topography of the land. What about the soil conditions? You see on here two things. There's a large wetland area in the back right corner, and there's a drainage easement in the back right corner. That wetland area and drainage easement severely hinders the usable area of the back land where we might otherwise look to place the garage to make it in compliance with the setback. Okay? So the soil conditions are definitely in play as far as this particular situation is concerned. The other thing is the topography of the land, and I've noted, and you can see it on the attachment, an elevation of approximately 104 at the back of the existing dwelling, back to an elevation of approximately 96 in this back area. I know you heard testimony from the petitioners at the October 22nd meeting. There's a severe drop-off from the area at the end of the driveway where we're proposing the garage to be to this back area. And that drop-off would necessitate, if we had to comply with the requirements of the bylaw and try to find an area, keep in mind, the only area where we could locate this garage that would comply, we can't just move it back, obviously, along the sideline. That's not going to gain us any setback. So we would have to push it over in order to do so. In doing so, we would end up, if we want to stay away from the underground fuel storage tank that you heard about at the October 22nd meeting, we'd have to put it somewhere back in that area, right where that property drops off severely. So how would we accomplish that from a practical standpoint? We'd have to do a couple of things. We would have to take down several trees on the property that you heard testimony about at the October 22nd meeting. I think there are upwards of 50 or more trees, I believe, were mentioned at the prior meeting. In addition to that, you'd have to bring in a considerable amount of fill in order to grade that back area to gain a suitably flat area where the garage could be located. That fill also has a potentially negative impact on a couple of things. Mention the wetlands that you can see on the plan, but also the petitioners put in a rather elaborate drainage system when they purchased this property. That would cause a major disruption of that drainage system in order to bring that fill in. So and then I touched on it briefly, but you heard mention at the October 22nd meeting of the need to relocate the underground fuel, the propane tank, an underground propane tank, which is right in this area, just off of the deck. So from both a practical to move that garage sufficiently off of that sideline would land us in an area that would require a great deal of reconfiguration of that backyard, from removal of trees, bringing in fill, and digging up and relocating that propane tank. Okay, I want to get to that in a second. So those are the factors as far as the statute is concerned relative to soil conditions and the topography of the land. Now, you also know that that's not the end of the analysis. Those conditions have to result in a financial hardship to the petitioner, okay? The financial hardship is sort of the cost of doing those things that we would have to do. The cost of bringing in the fill. Brian, I don't know if you have any kind of an estimate of
I
what
don't
that,
know the
of what
yards,
that
but
fill would
yeah,
be,
it
but you know, I think
substantial.
the board could take judicial notice of the fact that, you know, a considerable amount of fill, the removal of the trees, the relocation of the propane tank, that's going to be a considerable expense to the applicant. The other expense that I know was also mentioned is the whole purpose of this garage is to take the place of an off-site storage facility that the petitioners are currently using in order to store their vehicles at a cost of somewhere around $5,000 a month, I think you estimate, Steve?
No,
So I don't want to exaggerate. Okay.
I would say it's probably about $600 per month.
Okay, okay. Okay, I think, so we had an annual fee about,
Yeah.
okay, okay. So there's a considerable expense already being borne to store these vehicles off-site. It would save a lot of added expenses from the standpoint of the ease of having the vehicles right there on site, as opposed to having to pay for storage. And again, if we had to do the types of things that we would have to do to locate the garage in an area that would be compliant with that side yard setback. The last item, Mr. Chairman, if I may, is that the third aspect, the third leg, is that the desired relief may be granted without substantial detriment to the public good and without nullifying or substantially derogating from the intent and purpose of the bylaw. I don't think there would be any detriment to the public good. You folks are familiar with this location. It's there is another house here in Lot 4, but basically at the end of a cul-de-sac. There's no real traffic other than the residents, so this garage is not going to result in an increase in traffic. It's not going to result in an increase in pedestrian safety or any other detriment to the public at large. And it also fits with the purposes of intent of your bylaw. Your bylaw at section 235-1 purpose states, and if I may, Mr. Chairman, it says these regulations are enacted to promote the general welfare of the town, to protect the health and safety of its inhabitants, to encourage the most appropriate use of land throughout the town, to preserve the cultural, historical, and architectural heritage of the community, to increase the amenities of the town, and to reduce the hazard from fire by regulating the location and use of buildings and the area of open space around them. All is authorized by, but not limited to, the provisions of General Laws, Chapter 48, as amended. I took notice of the fact that in the town's zoning application sheet, the fire department, when they originally reviewed this application, had no objection to this application. The 4.5 feet on that side still gives plenty of room for fire personnel to get around the building. You heard testimony that we need to keep it a certain distance off of the dwelling. If I could comment, I believe there was also a question by a member that asked whether or not was it possible to attach the garage to the dwelling. And again, because of the basically angles from the existing garage versus the proposed garage, it's really not practical to be able to attach this to it. In fact, Brian, do you want to pass that around perhaps? I think the members would like to show you a sketch of the proposed garage. I think you'll see it is a very aesthetically attractive building. It's not going to be an eyesore to the neighborhood, and in fact, the one neighbor who would be most affected if the board were to grant the variance, Mr. Ma at 11 Summerfield to the right. You heard testimony from him at the October 22nd meeting that he had no objection to the application. In fact, you'll see as my very last exhibit, the last...
Objection on the location that you were putting it, he had objection if the garage were to be pushed back further, because then you could see it.
Exactly, and that's,
Right?
yes, exactly.
Okay.
And that was the point I was just going to make, so that not only did he not have an objection, he didn't want it pushed further back, because then it would be visible to him from his pool area. And you can see his pool in this picture, the last exhibit to my brief. So, you know, it's not enough, and I know it was said at the meeting, it's not enough that, you know, the neighbor supports it. The board still obviously has to make a determination that we meet the criteria. I would respectfully suggest that for all the reasons that I've mentioned, I do believe that we've fulfilled the criteria of Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 48, Section 10, in order to allow this board the discretion to grant the variance in the amount of 10.5 feet. Oh, finally, if I may, and then I'll be happy to turn it over for any questions. Since that October 22nd meeting, speaking of the neighbor, we did, the client did meet with him to discuss the possibility of a land swap in the area where the garage is located, to avoid the necessity for the variance. He wasn't willing to do that, which frankly can't blame him for that, but you know, he still supports the location of the garage where we're proposing it. He just didn't want to get involved in a sort of a more involved legal process with doing a land swap and all that's involved with that. So with that, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, we'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
I'm good for right now. Steve?
Okay, I'll go first. Okay, so I'm informal, so I'll call you Barry if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
I'm Steve, that works for me. So you already answered the question that variances are discretionary with the board. So even if you think you have all the criteria, it doesn't necessarily have to be granted, right?
Correct.
Now, how long have the current owners owned the house? There's a deed here somewhere?
Yes, there is. It's, I believe it's my first exhibit since 1996.
Okay, and when they bought it, the wetlands were there?
Yes.
So they knew the wetlands were there. Now, what about the propane gas tank? Was that there too?
I had it put in.
So you had it put in
When they built the house, I had the propane tank put in.
so that's also 20 years ago?
When I built the house, 26 years
Yeah,
ago.
okay.
Yep.
So by putting in the propane, and by the way, don't assume the position I take by the questions I'm asking, okay? So because you put in the propane yourself, you have now created the hardship that you're claiming, is that right?
Well, if I, excuse me,
Okay.
let me respond, if I may.
Yeah.
So I think in the case of the propane tank, certainly that was installed by my client. And however, the other conditions, although they were certainly aware of them, I don't think it can be argued that they are conditions that were caused by my client. The wetlands, the topography, the drainage easement, those are conditions relative to the land, not relative to actions taken by my client.
But you would agree if there were wetlands there, and presumably your client knew that at the time he bought the house, that he knew he couldn't use that land for any building, is that right?
You know, I don't know if the average lay person homeowner is aware of what that means, but, you know.
The builder would have determined where that tank went
The builder
and,
put the tank, I didn't have any say where
Right.
the tank was going. The builder put the tank in.
yeah.
I just went along with it. I had no intention of building the garage.
Okay, the tank is for your heat in the house?
Heat and, yes, heat and, you know, the dryer and the.
So it's on the cul-de-sac, so I'm assuming there are no,
No gas line.
No
gas
natural
lines
gas.
on the house?
No natural gas.
Okay, you could've had oil if you wanted though, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm asking
Yeah,
the
okay.
question.
Yeah.
I'm not choosing oil
My
over
wife
gas,
won't cook with a
although I have
stove.
gas in my house, so.
And I like to
Tells
eat.
you.
I like gas, yeah.
Okay, so the whole idea of this thing is not to improve the living conditions in the home, but to add garage space for cars that you currently keep off premises,
Yes,
okay, at the cost of I think you said $600 a month or $7,200
$72
a year.
Somewhere in that
Now,
area.
how many cars are kept off premises?
3,
How many people live in the house that have cars?
2.
Okay, backtrack. 2 people live in the house that have cars?
Yes.
Two people live in the house,
Yes.
but
Two
there
people
are
live in
more
the house.
cars than people.
Okay, that's what I'm
I
trying
have
to
antique
get.
cars.
Right.
Oh, so they're antique
Yes.
cars?
He has, right.
Okay, so you wanna move antique cars from a storage facility so you can better take care of them on your own land and keep them covered.
That's exactly right,
protected.
sir. Exactly right.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know. Okay. And, I think Barry already answered that, the suggestion was to connect directly to the house, and Barry said that aesthetics, it wouldn't look right, or it couldn't be connected.
I think from a practical standpoint, to connect the garage, I don't know, you've got 2 garages, sort of kitty corner with each other.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
Brian, you might be in a better position to respond.
There was without,
Right.
going in the wrong direction here, there was testimony at the last hearing that because of the natural gas tank where it's located, they
Yeah.
need that
Access.
space between the house and the garage to get the line back to the tank, I think was
Yeah,
the
exactly.
reason that
Yep.
was,
That's
what
correct.
we discussed.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Propane tank comes down
Right, so
the
to
driveway.
connect the 2, you would have to take some circuitous route to get to the propane
Yeah, or
tank.
move the tank to a more accessible
Yeah.
location, which I
Yeah.
think was the alternative
Yeah.
solution. So,
Okay, I'm good for now.
okay, John?
Yeah, I have a question or two. When you were reviewing in your brief the first standard that we have to examine, which is the unusual circumstances relating to soil, shape, topography, et cetera, et cetera. Most of what you said, I recall having been discussed at the last meeting. There was, I just want to make sure I heard this correctly. You also mentioned that, just now, I thought I heard you say that there was a drainage system that was installed. And I don't recall that coming up at the last hearing, and I'm wondering if you can expound on that in terms of what it is, where it is.
Brian would be in a better position.
Yeah,
or
actually,
Steve?
Yeah, I think he had it built.
As you can see that the driveway comes down at
Pretty good
a
pitch.
slope. So the water would come down off the driveway and it would puddle in the immediate backyard. So we had a French drain put in, and the land actually goes up about this high, and it goes down into the wetland. So there's an elaborate French drain system put in at a very high cost of money to myself. So it wouldn't puddle in the immediate back.
Yeah.
And how long after you built the house was it that?
It was done as the house was being built.
I see.
My builder, Briarwood Construction, suggested it.
Right.
As he suggested, putting a lot of gravel underneath the floor in the basement, so it wouldn't, the water wouldn't
Back
seep into
up.
the basement.
I see. And what was the, and in terms of, and this probably spills now into the whole idea of cost and everything, I mean, if the garage was gonna get put in the back, let's just say, how would that drainage system have to be reconfigured, and do you have any idea what it would cost?
I have no idea what it would cost, sir. I
It's
have no
because of
idea.
all the fill that would have to be now put back there, so then that French drain would basically get raised up. So you just have to reestablish the French drain. What it is, if you went to the property, it's just that all property has natural runoff and natural flows. The way his property is set up, the natural runoff is kind of down that driveway and continuing to the back, to that drainage easement. So it's a lot of water, like all the water we've had, these last couple of weeks, that area fills up. So it just runs down the driveway, it seeps into the drainage area and continues on. If we put this garage back in that corner, with the foundation, we got to put, 4-foot foundation wall, frost walls down and everything. We're gonna have to get a drainage, we're gonna just have to completely redo all that, or you're gonna get the same thing, puddling. You're just gonna have problems with water. So I think that's one of the large expenses.
That one, if you have to remove the propane tank and find another spot for it, they have advised me that it's a $15,000 expense to remove that propane tank.
And move it,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
replace it. They actually, they won't reuse it.
Yeah.
What's the lifespan of the tank?
I don't really know. It's been there since
Yeah,
we built the home.
the lifespan is pretty big, but they won't pull it out of the ground and put it in another location. It's like a septic tank. You can't take it and move it. You gotta take it, discard it, and put a new one in. It's just how they do it. And it's what you would want to do.
Yeah.
The chances of it getting a rupture in it or something, moving it, they won't do it. You'd have to put a new one in.
I'm not sure if this is totally relevant, but with the drainage system that you put in at the time the house was built, have you had any issues with water intrusion in the basement or?
No, none whatsoever in the basement whatsoever. In the back of the yard, sometimes you get a little, wet to walk in when it drains down. But, it would really have to rain substantially, but nothing in the basement, sir, nothing. Or in the garage.
Okay. All right. How long have you been using the off-site storage facility for your antique cars?
I have one car that I've had since for 28 years that's been in storage, and I have two more. Probably one that maybe 5 years, and probably one at another 15 years.
Okay. So you've been storing antique cars off-site for a minimum of 5 years?
Yeah, I had one, and then I got another, and then I got another.
Okay. All right. Have they always been stored at the same place?
No.
And is there anything is there an issue in terms of where they're being stored now? Is it are they gonna
I don't
bump
have
up the
access
rent?
to 'em. I don't have access to the cars. I cannot go in there and take out the car as I want. It's dead storage. So you go in there, it's there for 6 months, you pay for it for 6 months. At the end of 6 months, if you want to take it out, you have to find another spot to put it. I can't go in there, I cannot polish them, I can't fill up the tires, I can't do anything. I can't use them.
They're not,
It's just dead storage.
they're not registered.
They are registered. Yeah, I have one, now I do have one in my garage here. I have one of my babies that's in that garage. But my car goes outside along with my truck goes outside. Then the other two are in storage.
Okay. All right. I don't have any other questions now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a question on the map, looking at there's numbers across the elevation lines, correct, on the plan? If you look at it, it's mostly behind, except for this little triangular piece that sticks out close, that's 102 feet. And directly behind is a very large area of 100 feet. So conceivably, I don't see why a small little 10 or 12 foot move, and you wouldn't need to do any more fill, was not an option. And you'd have room to get around for the guy to fill the propane tank, and you'd still have the garage, almost in line of where it is now.
No, we still
I'm
have
not
to
sure
come.
where are you looking?
Forward.
You see here, it's 102, that's the line there,
Yep.
and 102 here. The house sits up at 106. This whole area in between is either 102 or 100, depending on how they...
Okay.
102 is a very small portion of my land, as you can see.
Oh, I'm just
102
saying,
is my neighbor's land.
I'm just saying this area in between is all the same level. Yeah, I'll bring it up to...
So you,
I don't know, I don't see the drain on there, but this is what I'll go up and point to it on the map. So here's 102. 102. And this is all 100. Unless I'm not reading that correctly, because it slopes like you described. 106, 104, 102, 90, so it's obviously going in that direction, which is what you wanted. But this whole area here, and if you could keep that, slight move over, and you kept that area, you could still service the propane tank and not,
I think it would have to go beyond the 100 area if what you're saying is an.
well, I mean, even if you went a little slightly over and, you would have, you'd have some of the 102, but you wouldn't have, just a,
Yeah, it's still a matter of French drain,
okay.
bringing in fill and removing,
So the drain system's directly behind there and everything? Okay.
yeah, and,
It's not shown on the plan, that's something.
yeah, and removing, a lot of trees.
There's a lot of trees there, too?
Yeah.
If you look at that very last picture, you can see how wooded the lot is.
Yeah. See what you mean. All right, I have any more questions?
I just wanted to know if Mr. Marr, the neighbor, was aware that we were having a meeting tonight on this.
Yes, he was.
And do you know if there's any reason he couldn't make it, or? 'Cause
He
I-
has 3 small children. They have soccer. They're very busy. He came to the last meeting,
Right.
It's
No,
very
I-
time-consuming for him.
We can assume that his testimony hasn't changed.
Yeah.
He'd be here if it was intended to be different than what it was last time. So for our purposes, we can assume what he testified about in October is his current position.
Part of his testimony was he wanted trees for a buffer to cover the garage. It's in the minutes.
What's that?
He wanted trees as a buffer to cover the garage.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I don't have any questions. Sir, are you here on this hearing?
I believe I'm in the right place, but I'm not sure what I'm here for.
Okay.
I was here as part of the Fellowship Church. They said, they sent us a notification for wetlands and, that's the
Is there
only
anything
reason
else
I'm
going
here.
on?
There's
Conservation
Conservation Commission upstairs?
Oh,
There's
it's the wrong
historical
meeting.
and there are 2 meetings upstairs.
And that's what I'm supposed to be?
Upstairs.
Sounds like it. If it's
Sounds
wetlands,
like
it's
it, yeah.
Conservation Commission.
But thanks for joining us.
Do you have any opinion on the garage, or? I don't have any other questions. Is there anything that the board wants before I turn it back over to the applicant?
No, not for me.
No? Nope. Anything else you want to add before we decide to vote to close the
Anything?
hearing, or?
No, I think, again, at the risk of being redundant, I appreciate the comments that the members have suggested regarding ways that we could possibly avoid the need for the variance, but I think what you've heard from us is the fact that we've looked at those things, and we could probably move it a little bit off the line, but I don't think the consensus between myself, Brian, and the homeowners is that there's really no way to fully comply and still avoid those costs that we've mentioned. So I think what this does is it kind of strikes a balance. It's the logical place for the garage. At the end of the existing driveway, it avoids a great many expenses that would be associated with relocating it or locating it to an area that would comply, that wouldn't need the variance. And I think there's, as I mentioned, there's no detriment to either the neighborhood or the community in general by the grant of the variance, underscored by the fact that the most directly affected neighbor, Mr. Ma, who was here at the October 22nd meeting, did indicate his support of the application. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank the board members for your attention, your consideration, and respectfully request that the variance be granted.
Did I hear you say, Barry, that you could move it a foot or two, but not? Is that what you just said? You might be able
Well, I
to
think-
slide it a notch?
If we, I should have been.
Be careful what you say,
Right,
yeah.
I mean, we could push it back, but now as we start to move it over, now you get into sort of an angle with the vehicle, so, I think.
You
I
could
think I
push
was-
it back parallel, so it
Yeah.
would still be the same
Yeah,
question on the variance.
right, I think I
You're
was
not
trying to.
pushing, you're not pushing it over.
Right,
So the variance number changes, okay.
Right. I think I was more trying to respond to Mr. McCall's point about, that elevation, that area, could we somehow tuck it in there? But again, physically, probably could, but again, from a practical standpoint, I think it creates other issues, and it doesn't avoid the other problems that we mentioned.
And Brian didn't want that back then either.
Yeah.
No, our neighbor,
Oh, I'm sorry.
because of the pool.
Right, exactly.
So let me ask you,
Screen,
if we were to approve the variance with a condition that you work with Mr. Mayor on, a tree screening or something along the garage, that's not an issue?
No, it is not.
Okay. Anybody want to make a motion to close the hearing?
Motion to close the hearing?
I'll second it.
Mr. McCall, seconded by Mr. Curran.
Yeah.
All those in favor? 5-0. All right. I'll start this one. I appreciate all the information that the applicant has provided to us. Does it definitively meet the criteria for a variance? I'm not sure 100%, but I think it's about as close as we've gotten on certain applications, and I do give strong weight to the neighbor's testimony that he prefers that we grant the variance and allow the construction of the garage in the location proposed, as opposed to requiring the homeowner to strictly comply with the zoning requirements and put it in a place where the neighbor doesn't want it, and is not necessarily cost effective for the applicant. That's my view. Anybody else can chime in, agree with me,
Well,
disagree with
I
me?
think for 2 out of 3, you're definitely right. Then it comes down to me, for the topography question of it. I mean, the neighbor doesn't object. The design certainly appears to fit in with the neighborhood. So it's really down to that last portion of the requirement. And I think they're willing to, make the neighbor happy. And I have to try to put myself in the applicant's situation. I'm not a car collector, but I know people that are, and being able to have access to things like that certainly makes your life more easier, and it is an expense to have to store the extra cars off-site. So I think reasonable effort has been made to comply with the variance. That's my opinion. Anything to you, Mr. Curran?
I think, for the most part, I would just probably echo the sentiments that have already been expressed with respect to what was presented, and to the extent that efforts are being made to sort of take the neighbors' feelings into consideration, I think it's commendable. From my perspective, I do see where there's a lot of expense associated with, if at the end of all of this, it has to be situated in that way back area that was described by Attorney Crimmins. I think there is a lot of expense associated with that, so, without casting a vote, that's sort of my impression of all of this.
Okay. Chairman, Steve?
I'm struggling with it as you did, Michael. The good aspects of the petition are it's on a cul-de-sac, and we have a neighbor who's willing to say, as long as you give me a buffered zone of some kind and keep away from my pool view, then I'm okay.
Okay. Chairman?
I feel the same way as all of you. I don't see any substantial detriment to the public good. Some of the other soil and shape issues are a little tenuous for me, but as long as the neighbor is happy, and kind of feel like if he's happy, then I'm happy.
Okay. Anybody want to make a motion on this?
Motion to approve the variance
With any conditions?
with the condition that the neighbor
Applicant.
meets with the applicant meets with the neighbor to come up with a plan for a screening, probably, some sort of vegetative screen of some kind, trees or shrubbery, and as long as they comply with that condition.
Does it have to be more specific than that?
I don't know that we need to necessarily get into a situation of being specific as to what needs to go in. I think in this situation, the applicant can work with the neighbor. If we have a condition that sufficient screening be installed to the neighbor's satisfaction, if the neighbor's not satisfied, he can always file a complaint with the building inspector regarding the issuance of a building permit. Or come back to us and say that the variance has been violated, so. You know, they say you need 3 such and such trees or 5 trees, I don't know, I don't know enough about it to,
Okay.
to try and put that condition on it necessarily.
Something to the effect of the neighbor's satisfaction, though, would,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I think with a vegetative screening, that to the neighbor's reasonable satisfaction. I think it's fine. So there's a motion in there somewhere.
There is.
Does
Should we-
anybody want to second it?
I'll second it.
Okay. Motion, we'll give Tim credit. Motion made by Mr. McCall, seconded by Mr. Curran. Any further discussion? All those in favor? 5-0.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
Have a
you.
good night.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
No problem.
You made my wife happy.
Happy wife?
Happy wife.
Yeah, understood.
Oh, thanks, no, have a good night.
Good luck.
Good luck.
Yep.
Thanks a lot.
Good night. No problem.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Yep. On its way. Oh, you're
Hey,
back
guys.
again.
Hello.
You guys can come right up to the table. We're just finishing admin stuff, so. No, you don't need it. Just sign both copies.
Yeah, there's 2, yeah.
All right. Oh, there's that. Evening, gentlemen.
How are you?
So, this isn't a hearing per se, it's just a request for, that the board consider changes to the decisions that were made on both Phase 1 and Phase 2 to be insubstantial changes. So, why don't we start by having at least an initial discussion, and one of the questions, well, why don't you guys just introduce yourself for the record, so we have
Sure.
you on.
Michael Roberts with Avalon Bay Communities. I have with me Darren Baird, counsel with Easton and Stores.
Great, thank you. Darren, real quick question
Yes.
for you on the, I think it's Phase 2 letter that you sent in. There were just a couple of references to sections in the original decision which didn't necessarily coincide,
Oh,
at least that we could figure out. So I just want to make sure that, A, you've had a chance to review the amended decision,
you did, yes.
okay,
Yep,
and that the substance of what's in your letter, albeit maybe not matching up specifically with the section, is actually translated from your letter into the actual
it
decision.
is, yes.
Okay.
Yep,
Okay, and the one I'm just looking at is Section 3, Paragraph 4
section 3, paragraph.
on page 3 of your letter. Doesn't appear to actually refer to Section 3, Paragraph 4 unless I'm looking at the wrong section. The language didn't make it into the final decision.
Bear with me for 1 second,
no
because I'll be
problem.
able to find that.
I think it's section.
It's actually
I think it's
section
section-
4, paragraph
section
4. Yeah,
paragraph
it's
4?
Roman numeral 4,
Yeah,
4.
okay.
And it looks like that just got out of,
And subsequent paragraphs are all in the same.
yeah, sorry, those section 3
That's okay.
references should be to section 4. I'm not sure how
What
that
I was,
happened.
what I was more concerned about was not that as much as you're comfortable that what
Yes.
you've gotten the letter, actually got into the final decision.
So the final letter that was submitted, actually lined up and made sure that it coincided with what was in the decision as far as the changes that we made between us and town council.
Yep.
So, yes, they match.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So, do any of you guys have any questions about what's in the letter, requesting the changes to the decision? And whether or not you have an opinion or a concern over whether or not any of the requested revisions are substantial or insubstantial?
I consider them insubstantial.
Okay.
So-
I would agree with you, Steve, but
Okay.
that's
Do we have
just,
to-
that's
do we
my
have-
opinion.
Do we have to take a vote that
We do have to take a vote on that.
that those
However,
are
okay, so
insubstantials? Okay.
we can, all right, let's take a vote. Nothing really for you guys to add, I don't
Yep.
think. We can take a vote as to whether or not the requested revisions to the Avalon Easton Phase 2 amended decision that we have in front of us are, or the requested revisions are insubstantial. Somebody want to make that motion?
So moved.
Motion made by Mr. Merlin that the requested revisions to the decision for Phase 2 are insubstantial.
Seconded.
Seconded by Mr. McCall. All those in favor? 5-0. Okay, before we decide whether or not this amended decision is final, let me ask you, do you guys have any additional changes to this? Are you comfortable with what we've got sitting in front of us, which is what town council had sent to you the other day?
We are, what we sent back to, Andrea, which was our acceptance of town council's final changes.
Yep.
Yes, we agree is the final version. We don't have any further changes.
Okay. So there's one issue that was raised, and I think it may have been brought to your attention at one point in the email exchange, I'm not sure. But in paragraph 31, it talks about the hours of construction and not starting prior to 6 a.m. Concern was raised that maybe the board wants to consider making that a later time, given that there are now residents in the area. I don't know if you have any objection. We haven't talked about it yet. What's your thought on it if we're inclined to want to make it 7 or 7:30 or 8 or whatever?
Yeah, we appreciate the concern. Obviously there are residents, so, it'll be a concern of ours as well.
Yep.
So, I would just ask, from our perspective, flexibility is the key. So it's not as if we would be starting construction at 6 a.m. every day of the week. It's just as part of a construction process, there might be times where an early start might be beneficial. I think the net goal is to just be to compress the construction schedule, as much as possible. But we appreciate the fact that there are concerns, so we're happy to talk to you about it or
Okay.
consider your thoughts.
Well, let me then go back to the board. Does the board have concerns over the construction start time?
Too early for me, 6 a.m. in a residential.
Yeah,
See, is there a town bylaw on construction time?
I think it's not before 6.
Not
Huh?
before 6?
But there's a noise bylaw.
There's a noise, but doesn't mean they can't, do some work on the site at 6. I don't know.
Well, it depends. The devil's always in the details. It depends what they're doing.
They have to comply with the noise
Right.
bylaw,
This is a 40B anyway, so we make our own rules.
more or less, sorta.
I think be able to pushing it back to like 6:30 or so. I mean, 6 a.m. is kind of early to have. I don't know what is considered noise in the construction world that's considered acceptable noise versus, I assume, cranes and everything of that nature are considered too noisy, but I don't know.
Power tools
Heavy,
and
heavy construction equipment, but,
Yeah, any kind
Um,
of power tools,
And maybe back up
putting on
half
the
an hour.
roof, it's all,
let me ask you this, do you
Yeah.
have any kind of language in your leases with your tenants that prohibits you from doing anything like this? I mean, I don't necessarily wanna,
Right.
tie you guys up in knots or
Right.
anything, but I'm just asking, I'm curious if there's,
Yeah, I mean,
are the
there's-
residents gonna be able to say, hey, wait a minute, you can't be, building out my
Yeah, I mean,
bedroom window at 6 AM.
Yeah, there's a couple levels to that. I think, in any event, our residents will let us know if there's an issue.
Oh, no doubt.
Regardless of the lease, and so we'll be cognizant of that. There are, quiet enjoyment clauses in our
Yep.
typical lease, so, off the top of my head, that's, if a resident was gonna turn to their lease, that's where they would go.
Yep. And I mean, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think that's,
Yeah, I mean, well, it kind of puts the onus on the residents, I
Yeah.
suppose, to say, this is what my lease says, and you're violating it, and to me, since we're here,
Yep.
it probably makes sense to try to come up with, at least some solution between
Yeah,
you and the board.
Yep.
It looks like it's been given some consideration, rather than just saying, well,
sure.
the leases can take care of anything if a
Yeah.
problem arises.
Yeah. No, we appreciate that. I mean, I can tell you, initial site work is gonna be, there'll be heavy machinery out there moving stuff around, so, that'll be, from a noise perspective, probably, impactful, and I can tell you, we wouldn't expect to do that work at 6 in the morning, there's a practical aspect of what we're trying to accomplish as well. And then when we're framing the nail guns, that tends to be kind of the other phase.
Yep.
And again, we won't be doing that at 6 in the morning, so, and then once we enclose the buildings, all the interior work, that's when it's really the least impactful, so, we're open to suggestions if
Well, even if, when you're at the phase where you're framing, for example,
Yeah.
is there prep work that would be done? Let's just say we approve 6 o'clock.
Yeah.
Is there prep work that would be done
Yeah.
that wouldn't be noisy
That's
between
where-
6 and 7 or something?
Absolutely. So that's where we'll hear from our subs who want to get a full day in. So they'll want to get on site, do whatever staging they need to do, get their equipment in place, in preparation of, the actual work. So,
I mean,
I mean, I don't want to go through
Personally,
every
I'm not in-
particular construction method, because then you're talking not in some.
well, I was
Yeah.
gonna say, I'm not
pushing it
necessarily
half hour maybe.
inclined to put a straight line, can't do anything before such and such a time.
I was just thinking like,
Yeah.
I mean, we could put something in regarding use of heavy machinery or construction equipment, that type of stuff, prior to 6:30 or 7, would be restricted, nail gun, but again, if we start naming things, then,
bigger change.
it's,
Right, then
you're leaving stuff out by
Right, and then the-
specifically talking about things, so.
And if you leave stuff out, then what was the intention? Was it done on purpose, or?
Or is it what it really is we just didn't think of it.
Right.
So I mean, I'm kind of, this is just my personal opinion, I'm kind of inclined to leave it as is, with the understanding, with the applicant that they will, use best efforts, and I have no reason to think they won't, to refrain from use of heavy machinery, construction equipment, nail guns, et cetera, until, say, 7 o'clock or something like that.
Yeah, I was just thinking of 6 is early, but I mean, most days it's gonna be a work day anyway, so most people will probably
Right.
be, a portion of it will be at work. But I'm fine with keeping it, it just doesn't matter. I think they're good, they've done a good job, I haven't heard any
Yeah,
complaints about things going
you've
haywire
built other
over there.
projects in phases, correct?
Yes.
And typically what happens when you've got residents in one and you're starting phase 2, like,
That's where, we self-perform all our construction, so we'll have our Avalon Bay construction group on site. There's a trailer, it's all about communication, weekly memos to the residents, this is what's happening when, at what times this week, and, that's where it's, the communication part comes into play. So it's a very fluid situation, as you can imagine, so, we view these timelines as obviously guardrails, but the reality is we're gonna work within what works just from a practical standpoint as it relates to impacts on our residents and the retail tenants as well, so.
I mean, I don't have any, like I said, I don't have any objection to leaving it as is. This is not an applicant the town's unfamiliar with. It's not an applicant that is new to the construction business, obviously, and I don't foresee them abusing the privilege and opportunity to leave the provision as is in the decision.
If anything happened where it got, hypothetically speaking, out of control or something, that we would hear about it, and
True,
there would be other ways to remedy the situation,
perhaps,
correct? Right,
perhaps not, but
perhaps not.
I'm willing to take that chance, given the
Okay.
circumstances. I don't think we're gonna be having that discussion, but in my opinion.
I think we have to vote changes to phase one are insubstantial as well. There's a second letter.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
Yeah,
we gotta get to that too.
yeah. Well, I guess listening to some of this discussion, I'm inclined to leave it the way it is. I mean, 6 o'clock seems early to me.
Yeah, I agree.
And
agree. Putting some faith in the applicant that they'll do what they've said that they
Yeah.
will do, which is, be mindful of the neighbors, and they're their own tenants. It's not, it's not like they built it, sold it, and now they don't care who's living there. They've gotta lease it up and rent it to new owners, and
Right.
they've gotta keep their
Are
current
We're
tenants.
talking about a
happy.
benevolent landlord, isn't that a
Exactly.
contradiction in terms? I'm sorry, I
No.
just couldn't help myself. No, Mike, I'm inclined to follow your lead on this. So,
Steve?
I agree. I might have voted for 6:30, but
Yeah, okay. All right, so it's not a hearing, but anything else you guys want to add?
No, again, we appreciate the concern, so we'll,
All right, so we have an amended decision and comprehensive permit application decision in front of us. We've found that the requested revisions to the decision that we signed at our last hearing were insubstantial. We've already made that determination. Does somebody want to make a motion to approve the amended decision as written?
I'll move to approve the amended decision as written.
second.
Made by Mr. Curran, seconded by Mr. Merlin. Seeing no discussion, all in favor? All right, so we're good on that. One more housekeeping thing. So and I was not paying as close attention to this one in the email exchanges as I was on our decision. Can you just give me a real brief
Sure.
overview of what the requested revisions on Phase 1's decision are?
yeah.
Okay, so, when the phase one decision was done, right, there was the land area, of phase one had an access drive coming off of Robert Drive across what's now the phase two lot.
Yep.
And connecting to the phase one project. As phase two is added, the lot line, there's a common lot line between phase one and phase two, and it will sort of all be one perimeter lot. We're gonna treat it as a single project, even though there's two comprehensive permits. So what the phase one insubstantial change is doing is two things. First, it is taking the plans that were approved by the board, and as it relates to the sort of northerly property line of phase two, where the southerly property line of phase one, that common boundary, some changes are being made on the phase one lot to support phase two. An at-grade parking lot along that common boundary, as well as some of the buildings on phase two come over the lot line onto phase one. And so none of the plans are different than what was approved as part of phase two. It was just amending the plan set for phase one to show that integration of stuff bleeding across the lot line.
Okay,
The second thing is the approval of an updated waiver list so that the waiver list for phase one and phase two are the same waiver list, to treat it as one project in 2 phases.
Okay.
So that's really, that's the request.
okay, fair enough. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Yep.
Anybody have any concerns over whether or not the requested revisions are substantial or insubstantial?
Well, insubstantial.
Insubstantial, okay. Anybody want to make a motion that the requested revisions are insubstantial?
So moved.
Moved by, motion made by Mr. Merlin, seconded by Mr. Curran. All those in favor? And that we approve the amended, we don't have an amended decision, but we've determined that the requested revisions are insubstantial. Now we have to approve an amendment to the decision to incorporate those requested revisions.
So, Mr. Chairman, before you do that, I just want to make sure that the final, I know the Word version attached in Exhibit B, I'm looking at the version you have in your hand and I don't see the waiver list attached to it.
I do not have the waiver list attached.
I'm happy to
no.
supply that if, because I was just looking at the backside of where
No,
yours ended.
yeah, I
It
don't
ended at
have the
plan
waiver
set.
list here. I know it,
So,
yeah.
I'll happy to hand this to you so you have it for your record.
Do you have it, Suzanne?
It was on the
And
Word
this
document.
is the same waiver list that we've
Same
got on
exact waiver list as
phase two,
Yep.
right? So
Yep.
we're going to incorporate this.
I just want to make sure you have it before you vote it, that's all.
Okay. So, why don't we do this? So we've determined, we've voted that the requested revisions are insubstantial. Just in the event that there's a difference, the applicant has advised us that the waiver lists are to be identical in phase one and phase two. So if we have a motion to approve the requested revisions to the phase one decision, and incorporate the same waiver list from the phase two decision into the phase one decision, or substitute that waiver list to the waiver list in the phase one decision.
So this is a new motion.
Correct.
Okay.
You made that motion?
I made that
The
motion.
one I just said?
Can you
Okay.
say it one more time?
We're voting to approve the requested revisions to the phase one decision and incorporate the same waiver list from the phase two decision and substitute that for the waiver list that is currently in the phase one decision. Did I say
Both
that right?
projects are
Yes.
merging
Good.
into one project.
Effectively, yes, but it's still 2 separate permits, so that's, that's the effect of what we're doing here. Yep. Okay,
That's-
so Mr. Curran made the motion, seconded by
Second.
Mr. McCall. All those in favor? All set.
Great.
Thank you,
For your
guys.
time.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Appreciate it.
Sorry about the mix-up the
No,
first go
no,
around,
we
but
appreciate,
Glad that thank you for,
appreciate your
Helping.
help and effort in getting it done.
of course,
So, all right, good luck.
thank you.
All right. Somebody want to make a
Permit.
motion to approve minutes from January 21st meeting?
So
moved by Mr. Merlin, seconded by Mr. McCall. All those in favor? Everybody's in favor.
Motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn by Mr. Merlin, seconded by everybody. All those in favor? 5-0. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Who has that decision down there?
So, you need a signature page for the decision that we just approved.
We have,
For phase one, right?
No, the signature page I signed was for the insubstantial change. So,
That's passed around, right? I got 2 back.
we have a decision. It
This
says
one.
February.
Oh, Mr.
Yeah.
Curran, how could you?
I was gonna say, I knew I didn't see that.
Can I just have the waiver list? How much?
Sorry about
Oh, yeah,
that.
we're done.
Trying to steal decisions.
I think the easiest thing to do
Can't.
is to take, so I haven't had a chance to review this updated waiver list. Take the waiver list from the
One in
phase
here.
2 decision,
Wait,
and
the
it-
phase two decision,
it should match up to this one.
the phase two decision is what you're signing.
Correct. So the waiver lists, ultimately, the waiver
Should
list
be identical.
should be identical in
Let's see if
both
that's true.
decisions.
Because we're gonna file the right thing. It's filed with, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, I saw, I did see this.
Yep, no, it came in.
It was in one of your attachments. I
Yeah,
know that.
yeah, I saw
Okay.
this. I did see that.
So that's
Just
gonna
one page?
effectively do, that's all I got. Believe so.
You only have one of these, Steve?
Sign the,
Oh,
I thought it was.
Steve has it.
Steve has it.
What's that?
He can sign the decision.
So that waiver will now effectively be for both projects, just one waiver. Same thing.
Yeah, you still gotta look at it as two different projects technically, but
Thank you.
it's,
Be blessed.
thanks, Jeremy. You too. Good luck with your motion.
Yes. Wait, what is this?
That's the signature.
For this, where the whole decisions are.
Yeah, I'm gonna see you like
No, I cashed it, they never sent it back. Who has the, and then-
How are you?
Good, just wanna say hello.
Hey, you too. Nice to see you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Good.